reasonable requirements and they're being tripped up instead of supported.
Even the government's own research reflects some of that. Matthew Oakley, a former advisor to the Treasury, has expertise in welfare reform. He was commissioned to look at how the system was communicating with claimants. His review concluded that the system was largely functioning well, but there were areas for improvement. And on the question of whether everyone understood what was expected of them, the answer was no. During his inquiry, Matthew Oakley was told by Job Centre staff themselves that people with additional needs were actually penalised more often.
Found was that there's a bigger challenge to really communicate and help the most vulnerable and understand the system. I think here we can't be too unfair on job centres, on providers, on the department. They do face a huge challenge. You're talking about, I think, 22 million claimants a year, 5 million households, I think. That is a real challenge because of the breadth of vulnerabilities, difficulties, issues that these people are facing. A lot of people on these schemes are on these schemes because they need help, because they need that kind of level of support, which means they have vulnerabilities and difficulties understanding something sometimes.
Well, you've just put your finger on it, haven't you? They need a level of support that they don't appear to be getting from the system.
The key point here is that the system needs to make sure that communication is tailored effectively for those groups.
We asked to visit a job centre to interview staff about their approach, but the Department for Work and Pensions refused to allow us access to any of them. We asked to interview ministers about these matters, but they refused to allow us access to any of them as well. Which was disappointing, because I was trying to understand how someone with dyslexia, who was clearly struggling to navigate the requirements placed upon her, could achieve 48 steps every fortnight, and why, when she was only one short of that total, she had her benefits stopped. The DWP told us,
"Our records say this person agreed to perform 28 steps a fortnight to look for work. Job Centre Plus advisors work hard every day to help people into work, and sanctions are only used in a small minority of cases where benefit claimants don't hold up their end of the bargain to look for work. Decisions aren't taken lightly, and we have a well-established system of hardship provision for vulnerable claimants. The number of sanctions has gone down over the past year."
Perhaps she was the victim of overzealous staff at the job centre. If that were the case, it wouldn't come as a surprise to some of those who've worked within the system. We've interviewed a whistleblower, a man who was a personal advisor to claimants for nearly a quarter of a century. He left the service in 2013, but he's told us about a disturbing culture among some of his managers. For legal reasons, we're not identifying him.
Management encourage staff to view the customer as an obstacle to performance. Every opportunity with a customer was an opportunity to sanction. We were encouraged to view the customer as the lowest of the low. It didn't matter what they'd done. The fact that they were claiming benefit meant they were up for some special treatment.
I mean, some people do game the system, don't they?
Undoubtedly.
And you'll have met a few during the course of your career.
I have, but if you're an experienced advisor, or if you've worked in a job centre for any length of time, you can spot the people who are trying it on. It's not the majority, it's a handful. They are the hardcore, they know the system. But we were encouraged to adopt an approach to everybody that came in and made a claim for benefit. The same approach, target them, set them up to fail, sanction them, make life difficult for them. In fact, one of my managers told me to agitate the customer. Let's make sure he doesn't like coming in here, and hopefully he'll sign off.
The whistleblower says that in one case this amounted to more than making life awkward. He claims that one manager actually cooked the books by setting up bogus appointments which job seekers were required to attend but couldn't because they weren't told about them.
There were occasions where I would book an appointment for a customer to come and see me, get job search advice and to look for work. And the manager in the office would wait until the customer had left the office, then change that appointment to a date sooner, in full knowledge that the customer would not be able to make the appointment, but also not informing the customer of that change. The outcome of that is that the customer misses the appointment, and therefore the claim is either closed, or should they come in before the claim is closed, they're sanctioned for missing an appointment. So the manager actually made up the appointment in order to hit a target, to sanction, or to get a person off benefit.
How many times did that happen?
It happened quite a few times, and I had evidence, and I passed that to my manager.
Did you confront the person who was doing this?
Well, I brought it to my manager and asked them to confront the person. There was no change in the behaviour. That manager continued to do those kind of appointments. The reason I found this out was because one of my customers rang me up to say he couldn't come in for the appointment because he was feeling ill. While he was still on the phone with me, I rebooked his appointment for the following Wednesday. The next day when I came in, I saw that his appointment had been booked for that day, that particular day, and the manager had put in the note box, appointment rebooked, letter handed to customer by hand.
But he hadn't been in?
He was ill, but that was the sort of comment that was made in every rebooked appointment. Appointment rebooked, letter issued to the customer by hand, and it just didn't happen.
The man says he gathered evidence while he was still at work and passed it on to his seniors, but that when he left, data protection laws meant he couldn't take that information with him. That means the BBC has no way of verifying what he alleges. Through an MP, he's since taken his concerns to the Secretary of State, who he said authorised an inquiry led by a senior civil servant. With no minister to interview about these claims, File on 4 asked the Department for Work and Pensions to respond. They told us,
"There was a thorough investigation and we found no evidence of what is being alleged."
Staff in the service are supposed to be there to help people back into work. But according to the PCS, the union that represents Job Centre Plus workers, they're under pressure to meet performance criteria. General Secretary Mark Sawatka says PCS staff surveys show disciplinary measures are even being used against those whose strike rate on sanctions is low.
23% of respondents told us they were given an explicit sanctions target. Now, the DWP denies there are targets, but our members told us 23% of them were given an explicit target.
Ministers have consistently told Parliament there are no explicit targets, time after time.
Well, they have, and what they say, of course, is that there are, inverted commas, expectations. And, of course, what expectations are, in the words of politicians, and not how they're being implemented by their managers. And so we've been told, for example, that 66% of people were pressured into making an inappropriate sanctions referral, and that we had a third of people who were given performance improvement plans, and 10% put into a formal performance process because they weren't felt to be sanctioning enough.
But it might be appropriate to put people on some kind of performance plan if they're really not sanctioning people who ought to be sanctioned.
Well, I think the point about our survey was that people felt that they were inappropriate referrals. If you do not meet the targets that are set out in that plan, you go into a formal personal improvement package, which actually then is a disciplinary measure. It can ultimately result in people losing their job.
Because ministers have insisted there are no targets, we wanted to test that assertion, which is in marked contrast to the situation described by the union and our whistleblower. But no one would come onto the programme to explain the difference of view. The DWP told us,
"There are no targets for sanctions."
If all of this amounts to some people being unfairly treated, what recourse do they have? Well, there is a system of appeals, but according to its critics, that isn't working well either.
Coventry Law Centre, Alex speaking.
That's the immigration team down there. This is the benefits bit here. This is where all the casework gets done, and you can see all our...
This is Coventry Law Centre, one of a dwindling number of places still taking on welfare cases. The Law Centre Federation says cuts in legal aid have meant some other centres can't afford to do much, if any, of this type of work. At Coventry, Janet Gurney has 30 years' experience in this specialist field. She finds the numbers getting through to appeal are low.
The national figure, the estimates are somewhere between 1% and 3% of people who've been sanctioned who go to appeal. It might be a little bit more perhaps in Coventry because we've tried to do some work, but it's still going to be in single figures. It's going to be very low. It's because people don't have sufficient faith in the system, because people have had an emergency situation. If they're left without money, and they have no warning of that, their immediate concern is, how am I going to manage? Their immediate concern is not, can I start a legal process that in 4 or 5 or 6 months' time might give me my money back? It is, where do I get some money now?
Nevertheless, a few do fight their corner. One of them in Coventry is a 53-year-old man we're calling John. He's severely disabled. John's a double amputee with other health problems. On the day we met, he was dressed all in black, hunched in a corner in his wheelchair. His voice is not strong, and he doesn't like to meet your eye, but he shows a quiet determination. In 2012, John was being assessed for employment and support allowance, a benefit which has two main categories: those who need support because they cannot work, and those who are ill or disabled, but who nevertheless are expected to prepare for a job and get one if they can.
I was put into the category where I was prepared to work. I had a phone call from somebody, and he said to me that they would like to interview me, and I had to be in a situation to look for work. But at the time, after I had my legs amputated, I had a heart attack, and I had to go to hospital. And shortly after I had the heart attack, I got a phone call from the Job Focus people, and they said to me that they would like me to attend the Job Focus interviews.
John says an arrangement was made to telephone him at home for one of these interviews, and it was made clear to him that he must take part in the phone call.
They said that I had to be at the phone, and they were going to phone me at a certain time, and I missed the phone call, and then they sent me a letter saying they were going to visit me in my flat. I had to wait till the Friday. The Friday came, then they didn't call to my flat, and then I went to ask reception if anyone had called for me. The receptionist said nobody called for me.
John's account is that DWP staff had visited the sheltered complex where he was living, but had gone to the wrong flat by mistake. Following this, he was sanctioned. Unable to cope, he made contact with Janet Gurney from the Law Centre, who reviewed his case. She challenged the DWP about whether a man with such severe disabilities should have been put into work-related activities in the first place. All John's benefits have been stopped, yet the rules for his kind of allowance say only a proportion can be taken away by sanction.
That's a very serious thing to do to somebody when they are dependent on benefits, is to stop their funding. And actually they had stopped the wrong amount. And had he not come to us, they would have continued to stop the wrong amount. I was able to get the ongoing sanction stopped and at least get the right amount then paid.
So when they took all his benefits away, how much did that represent per week then?
That was actually quite a lot of money. We're talking here about £150 per week, something like that, because he had extra premiums for his disability, and they actually stopped all of that as well as his basic amount. So it is quite a lot of money for him to lose.
Janet Gurney also argued that John shouldn't have been sanctioned until he had a proper visit from the authorities and a chance to explain himself. Eventually, the case ended up at Independent Tribunal, where judges accepted that because of his disabilities, John had good cause for not answering his phone calls that day. So what was the justification for sanctioning? Janet Gurney doesn't know, because the DWP didn't turn up in court.
As in John's case, most of the time the DWP do not attend the tribunals. They rarely attend.
Is there any reason given for their non-attendance at all these hearings?
Well, they would say they're not staffed to do that. Local appeals are prepared in Walsall, the other side of Birmingham, so it's quite a long way for them to travel. But over the years that I've been doing appeals, it's become less and less frequent that they attend at any appeals. But certainly sanctions, this type of appeal, no, we don't see them.
Does it matter if they don't turn up?
I think it does matter. I actually think it's really important that the DWP get feedback as to what happens in court cases where they have made a decision. It might make it harder for me to win the appeal, but I actually think it's more important that they find out what judges think about the cases. That's the test of what the law is, and they feed that back so we can improve the standards of decision making.
Coventry Law Centre report a sanctions appeal success rate of around 80% at Independent Tribunal. They say, therefore, there are plenty of lessons to be learned. These tribunal cases have become increasingly rare. According to Dr. David Webster of Glasgow University, that's because government changed the rules on appeal, requiring all claimants to first go through an internal review.
since 2013, claimants have not been allowed to go to an independent tribunal until they have made a request to the DWP for reconsideration and had a formal rejection of their request to overturn the sanction. And what the statistics show is that that provision has pretty well killed off tribunal hearings. There were only a couple of dozen on JSA or ESA sanctions in the whole of the 3 months from April to June.
I mean, isn't it right that the system should consider itself before going off to what is effectively a court of law? Because it's highly bureaucratic and therefore it might be rather more prone to mistakes.
Yes, there is a good deal of sense, and of course there's quite a strong incentive to the claimant to ask for informal reconsideration first, because it's a much easier and less demanding procedure. But the problem about prohibiting claimants from going to the tribunal first is the delay. The DWP has not published any information on these so-called mandatory reconsiderations, so we don't know how long they're taking. But the suspicion is that because the flow of tribunal cases has fallen to practically nothing, the suspicion is that the DWP is sitting on these cases for months and months. So, you're imposing a tremendous delay on the claimant if you don't allow them to go straight to the tribunal.
So, what's been the hold-up? With no minister prepared to answer that question, the DWP told us,
there is no available data on the length of time for decision reviews, which means that no assumptions can be made.
The bigger debate about the effects of sanctions is about to be reignited. There's a new report in the offing from a group of churches. File on 4 has had exclusive access to some of the research. It includes information based on government data about sanctioning those with mental health problems, people who need a lot of support and understanding from a complex and demanding system.
Because essentially you get sanctioned for not jumping through hoops, people who find it difficult to jump through hoops are more likely to be sanctioned. So somebody who has mental health problems, for instance, is more likely to be sanctioned.
Paul Morrison carried out the research. It's unearthed shocking new data on numbers who've been penalised, despite being told by medics and the authorities they're too ill to work.
For people who have been assessed by their doctor, by ATOS, the government's private sector contractor, and by the Department of Work and Pensions, to be too sick to work because they have mental health problems, they are more likely to be sanctioned than other people who are judged too sick to work. They were just as likely to be sanctioned as everyone else in 2010, but at the moment, the latest data that we have, which is from March 2014, we find that they are more likely to be sanctioned than other people who are unfit to work.
What are the actual figures on that then?
Around about 100 people a day who are judged as unfit to work because they have mental health problems are sanctioned at the moment.
A day?
About 100 people a day, yes.
Seems an extraordinary number.
The last number we have is about 4,500 for March 2014. We expect that to drop a little because some people will appeal.
Paul Morrison says it's hard to understand why people who've been deemed too poorly to work should be sanctioned for not complying with conditions aimed at getting them back to work.
Somebody who has passed these extraordinarily rigorous and some would say unfair tests, such that they prove to the satisfaction of the department that they are unable to work, that they should then be threatened with sanction, seems utterly unjust, especially for this group. The threat of sanction is almost as damaging as the sanction itself. That's extraordinary that we would do that to people, and it's even more extraordinary that we would use the justification that it's really helping them.
These are people, are they, that are not complying with conditions that are there to supposedly help them prepare for work, should they become better?
The main reason for people in this group being sanctioned is that they've either been late for or not turned up to an appointment with a work programme provider. People with mental health difficulties often find it difficult to talk to people, to go out, to go into social situations. So sanctioning someone with mental health difficulties for not turning up an appointment is a little like sanctioning someone with a broken leg for limping. It's a symptom of the disease.
In some more extreme cases, the consequences of that can be catastrophic.
She made a suicide attempt in her 20s. She ran away from home and was out all night. She tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose of tablets, and we just realised she was having a mental breakdown.
50-year-old Linda Holt recalling the start of her sister's health problems. Sheila Holt has bipolar disorder and hasn't been able to work. She was on benefits for nearly 30 years.
From time to time, she would have terrible relapses. She'd either barricade herself inside the house so that the family couldn't get in, and she wouldn't answer the telephone. On one occasion, she actually starved herself and lost 10 stone in weight, which was really distressing for the whole family. And she got slightly paranoid and heard voices and said she didn't want to speak to any of the family, and the police had to break down the door, and the social workers and doctors had to get her sectioned for her own safety, really, on the grounds of self-neglect.
But Sheila had periods of well-being too, and during one of these, in the summer of 2013, was being evaluated by her local job centre in Rochdale for employment and support allowance. ESA is supposed to offer personalised help for those like Sheila. As always, there are conditions attached to the receipt of the benefit, and hers were fairly typical for those who were expected to find some sort of employment: that she met regularly with a workplace advisor, and that she attend a course which was run by outside providers hired by the DWP. It's called work-focused activity. But because she was fragile, it proved too much for her.
I think it was in November that it became apparent to me that Sheila was very anxious about attending the sessions, which were in Middleton, which were 2 bus rides away from Rochdale. She didn't really like travelling on her own on a strange route. And
did that make her nervous?
I think it did, really, when there were a lot of people around and not knowing exactly where she was going. That phased her out. And I had asked in July at the job centre in Rochdale if Sheila could have a placement in Rochdale because of her bipolar disorder and her anxiety, but they said, oh no, she'll just be allocated a random centre. We have no control over that. Sheila was 100% willing to give it a go, and I think probably she could have managed 1 day a week under supervision with a mentor in a phased kind of way.
But that didn't happen. Instead, a vulnerable woman with a history of serious mental illness became disturbed. A family says her doctor recognised the warning signs and wrote her a sick note, which was handed over to her advisor. But thereafter, Sheila kept getting letters from her workplace providers demanding she meet her conditions and threatening her with loss of benefits, even though she was now deemed too unwell to attend the course.
As far as I understand it, they're automatically generated letters that come out every 6 weeks, and they just detail all the appointments that you have to attend. So they kept on coming regardless of the sick note being submitted to Sheila's advisor.
But why was that so stressful then? Because she had a perfectly good reason, having been signed off by a doctor.
Because I think she felt that she was doing something wrong, and Sheila was a very law-abiding person who was quite afraid of authority. These letters seemed quite strongly worded, saying you could lose your benefits if you don't attend your appointments. So it did make her panic. She just went into an immediate manic episode. She was having sleepless nights. She was wandering around the town trying to see the police and to the A&E ward, saying that she wasn't coping very well and she needed help. The outcome that Sheila suffered is the worst possible result. The government must have Sheila's case on its conscience.
On the 6th of December 2013, Sheila Holt was sectioned and admitted to a psychiatric unit. 10 days later, she had a heart attack and lapsed into a coma, and that's how she remains more than a year on. Her family argues there's a strong link between the compulsion to attend work placement sessions, the threat of benefit sanctions, and the deterioration of her health. A local MP took up her case, and a government minister for the disabled subsequently offered an apology. The organisation in Rochdale which had been helping Sheila Holt to prepare for employment is a charity called Groundwork. They say they weren't responsible for the generation of the automatic letters. Groundwork told us they were contracted by another organisation called CTEC, which did send the letters. CTEC said that was standard procedure, but that they should not have been issued in this case. CTEC say the mistake happened because of delays caused by Job Centre Plus in not notifying them about a change of circumstances. CTEC have apologised for any distress they caused. Sheila Holt's case ended terribly. So how much do we know about the overall effects of benefit sanctions? That's a question troubling the Shadow Minister for Employment, Labour's Stephen Timms, who's been trying to get latest figures from the government about the amount of money taken away from people.
Early last year, I tabled a parliamentary question to ask not how many people have been sanctioned, but how much money was being taken off them altogether. And the answer was very interesting because it showed that in the year before the election, £1 million a month was being withheld in job seekers allowance fixed sanctions. But in the 6 months, April to October 2012, which was the most recent period that I could ask about when I tabled the question, £10 million a month was being withheld. So that's a tenfold increase. And I think that does start to explain what's been going on. Now, in October 2012, a new and more draconian system of benefit sanctions was introduced. And for the past 18 months, I've been tabling questions to ask how much is being withheld now. And ministers have simply refused to answer the question time after time.
Why is it important to have these figures?
Well, because I think it does explain why things have been so difficult for so many people who've been sanctioned. In particular, why the food banks are reporting this enormous number of people, 250,000 or so in the last year, who are turning up in a food bank saying, I can't afford to buy food for myself and my family because my benefit's been sanctioned. That's what we really need to understand.
Mr Timms succeeded in winning a parliamentary debate about this very matter, during which Minister for Employment Esther McVey gave her reasons for not handing over the figures.
We do not routinely collect information of benefits withheld because of a sanction that has been imposed, or benefits that would have been claimed had someone not been disentitled. So we cannot produce the figures without making a number of assumptions and judgments about people's behaviour, and the resulting figures would be very misleading.
All I'm really asking for is an update of that table that was provided on the 25th of March 2013. I take the point that it'll need to be caveated and people will need to be told that it's not what it may at first appear to be, but we just need an updated version of that, then the House will be happy.
But he still didn't get his figures. Stephen Timms' concerns are echoed by Citizens Advice Bureau. Data they've gathered shows almost half of those who go to food banks have problems with welfare payments, with sanctions being the second most common reason given. But unemployment figures are coming down. So are sanctions and the conditions they enforce actually helping in the drive to get more people back to work? That's hard to know, because according to Paul Morrison, policy advisor for the Methodist Church, government doesn't record what happens to those who come off job seekers' allowance, so it can't say whether being sanctioned or the threat of it has played a part in getting a job.
The Job Centre Plus measures itself by off-flow, so the number of people that are off benefit. They don't really count where you go to once you leave benefits, they just count that you've left. For Work Programme, they have data on whether or not people get jobs and whether they sustain jobs. And it's fascinating that for Work Programme, you're 1.5 times more likely to be sanctioned than you are to get a job. Which, again, it's extraordinary. It should perhaps be called the sanction programme. There's no evidence that the sanctions regime within it is helping people get back into work. By forcing people really quickly off benefits, you're actually storing up problems for the future.
Dr. David Webster, who submitted evidence on sanctions to the Work and Pensions Select Committee, has been grappling with what information can and can't be found within government departments. And he's reached some troubling conclusions. Is it easy then to get meaningful data out of the system?
On quite a lot of aspects of operation of the system, you can get data out. Yes, and then you can supplement that if you carefully word some freedom of information requests. You can also get further information that way. So the system doesn't completely lack transparency. But there are a lot of important questions on which information isn't being published.
Doesn't it punish shirkers like the government wants?
Well, it might do, but all the research I've seen indicates that shirkers are very good at manipulating the system. And you often see it quoted in research that job centre staff say, it's not the shirkers who get caught by this because they know how to get round the rules. It's vulnerable people who primarily get caught by it. If you set out to design a system that would maximise inefficiency and waste and misunderstandings, you really couldn't do better than the DWP has done with the system that it's operating.
What is there about the sanctions system, then, that works well?
Nothing. Nothing about it works well. It's a shambles.
Ministers insist it's helping more people back to work, but they wouldn't explain to us how. If you're on the government scheme to tackle long-term unemployment called the Work Programme, how come you're more likely to be sanctioned than get a job? And what is the justification for sanctioning 100 people a day whose mental health problems mean they've been declared unfit to work? All questions which, on this programme, no minister was prepared to answer.
The reporter in this week's File on 4 was Alan Urie, and the programme was produced in Salford by Nicola Dowling. Next week, as the NHS copes with peak winter demand, where have all the nurses gone? Jane Deeth asks why we're forced to rely so heavily